Hello, I'm Alaa Mustafa. I'm here to discuss my paper entitled A Critical Study of Mahfouz's Representation of the Oppressed Intellectual During the Nasserite Experiment. My paper starts with introducing the topic, introducing the typical definition of intellectual, which usually comes to mind associated with certain professions, such as being a writer, journalist, or academic professor. The beauty of reading Mahfouz's literature is that it makes one question, basically, the rigidity of this intellectual definition that was familiar through theory or through common sense, through the typical classification of intellectuals. Mahfouz portrayed the intellectual crisis specifically during the Nasserite era differently, and it's important to study them because during the Nasserite era there was oppression and there was a lot of censorship. So fiction was a very important outlet for one to understand how the context truly was, even sometimes more than non-fiction, because non-fiction was always either cut down or people were imprisoned, or fiction itself was censored, which shows how much it's a very strong political tool. I will be using Mohammed Hassanin Heikel, who could be considered as one of the spokesmen of the regime, or one of the extreme defendants of the regime and right-hand wing of Nasser, to see the arguments he puts forth to defend the regime's position during the intellectual crisis. I want to explain first my research question. My research question is basically how Mahfouz depicts, I studied how Mahfouz depicts the intellectual in the selected 4 novels. The 4 novels are ثرثرة فوق النيل, which is Adrift in the Nile, The Beggar, الشحاذ, The Thief and the Dogs, اللص والكلاب, and Miramar. And how specifically the intellectual adapted or rejected actually this crisis, as portrayed obviously by Mahfouz. The first section of the paper basically intends to contextualize the novels, as I find it impossible to understand literature without clearly fathoming the state in which basically the context in which they were written in. The second section then moves to discuss novel by novel, starting with The Thief and the Dogs, followed by The Beggar, then Adrift on the Nile, finally Miramar. The final section basically attempts to draw reflections on Mahfouz's intellectual representation and the viability or the possibility of reading his literature as sort of a reflection of the socio-political situation of the Nasserite context. The reason why I selected these specific 4 novels is because they were all written during the 60s, and the protagonists in these novels usually epitomize the varying models of intellectuals, whether they're rejectionists, reformists, supporters, or opportunists, as a matter of fact. Most of the intellectuals are portrayed to either have been exiled or deal with exile at some point, whether it is being self-imposed exile or real prison, or someone that they know has been imprisoned. So there's always the effect of the exile theme. The paper basically intends to focus on this concept and basically the self-imposed exile as a resort, whether from the oppression coming from the society or from the state, or from both. So hence I chose these 4 novels because these themes are very prevalent in these 4 novels. I will start now talking about the context itself of the Nasserite era. Basically, the intellectual crisis started when the free officers took over in 1954, and from that moment onwards the crisis was exaggerated because of several factors. The first section here, which is the one I'm discussing right now, intends to discuss these factors so that later on I can understand how they were depicted in Mahfouz's literature. Hamouda basically talks about 3 significant factors, in his opinion, that have caused the crisis for the intellectuals. First, was relevant to the army's retreat back to the barracks. This is also mentioned in Hakel, one of the defendants of the regime, as I said before. He has a collection of articles where he basically discusses the intellectual crisis. He also mentioned that part of the crisis was because the army refused to return back to the barracks after 1954 takeover, and the dilemma started then. Also, the second factor would be because the intellectuals wanted to reinstate parliamentary life and basically get back or resort back to political pluralism. Various demonstrations broke out in March 1954 calling on the army to restore parliamentary life, but this did not happen. Demonstrations took place by activists and lawyers and syndicates, university professors, all sorts of intellectuals, but there was no result, and the army basically remained in power. The final factor was the fact that it's one of the most famous characterizing the Nasserite era, which is the prioritization of people of trust over people of experience. Here, there were also other factors that exaggerated the crisis. This included the mal-execution of ideas that the intellectuals used to call for pre the revolution. So basically the intellectuals were not happy with the fact that there was a mal-execution of their own ideas that were borrowed later on by the revolution by the free officers, and over and above that there was a very high price paid for this mal-execution. This high price, for instance, included loss of Sudan, consenting to Britain's right to military intervention. This is the kind of high price. An additional factor that also caused the intellectual crisis was the fact that there was a lack of coherent ideology. The free officers' ideology was very much reactionary. So the intellectuals, the ideological intellectuals specifically, were very frustrated by the fact that this is a reactionary ideology rather than a real clear ideology. Obviously, one of the most important factors as well was the extreme measures that were taken against the intellectuals. For instance, imprisonment, isolation, exile, inhumane torture in prisons, those sort of disciplining mechanisms, obviously censorship, etc. Finally, one of the biggest factors as well is the 1967, the Naksa, the 1967 war, which depressed many intellectuals, and this was very much symbolized and exemplified in specifically Mahfouz's literature, Adrift on the Nile. It depressed many intellectuals, and it highlighted very much the Nasserite regime's inadequacies, and basically the intellectuals who still had aspirations of the regime lost them by 1967. Later on I will be discussing how this was specifically portrayed in Adrift on the Nile by Mahfouz. So basically all four novels, this is my second section, and I start by basically explaining novel by novel. All four novels are not isolated from one another, but rather are a product of this oppressive reality manifested on intellectuals. There were different routes taken by different intellectuals, and hence it's very important to study the different characters or the different intellectuals portrayed by Mahfouz to see the different reactions by each intellectual to the crisis. I'll start by talking about the thief and the dogs, discussing the thief and the dogs. Basically, there were two types of intellectuals that Mahfouz represents in his short novel. One is Said Mahran. This is the thief, the protagonist. Mahran is the poor student who transformed into a thief, stealing money and legitimizing it through a Robin Hood cause. Raouf, however, the other main character, an intellectual, a teacher. Raouf was specifically Said Mahran's teacher, who was basically a Marxist intellectual and a former leader of the student movement who supported the 1952 revolution. Said was caught stealing and got imprisoned, and after that he comes out of prison and he ends up meeting Raouf, only to see a very disappointing transformation in Raouf. Raouf has sold all his values for basically a villa or a castle by the Nile and a luxurious car. And Said was very disappointed to see that his Marxist teacher or Marxist intellectual has sold his values that way.